Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's UTA College of Engineering Industry Alumni Virtual Brown Bag Seminar. We've got a good one today for you with Paul Arrendel and Phil Brown, Trends in Medical Device Manufacturing and Regulatory Environments. Before we get started, I just have a couple housekeeping items. First of all, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box at the top right-hand side of your screen. We'll be monitoring those, and we can ask those questions during the presentation or at the end, however they come in. The recording of this seminar today will be available on our website at the same link that you clicked on from our webpage, also on our YouTube channel. And we do have the link to those posted in the Q&A. And also, you'll be able to see future sessions. You can go to our website, and that link is also in the Q&A. You can see what the future sessions are, look at the sessions prior to this, and see the recordings of those. So if you're interested in the virtual brown bag seminars, there's your access point for all of that. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'll introduce Paul and Phil. Paul Arrendel is a vice president at Jabil, a publicly traded worldwide manufacturing services company, overseeing the global quality and compliance organization within the company's regulated industry sector. He and his teams work to develop innovative solutions to reduce product time to market, designing manufacturing process automation strategies, and working with IT and moving from a functional focus to an enabler of innovation. Paul earned bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from UTA, specializing in adaptive feedback control systems. He is an American Society for Quality certified quality engineer and a design development international facilitator. His technical specialties include design and process engineering, Lean Six Sigma, manufacturing automation solutions, and international regulatory requirements for medical devices. Paul's career spans various roles with the U.S. Department of Energy, automated assembly of semiconductors, and automotive climate control systems. He made his way to healthcare as part of Abbott Laboratories' diagnostics division, then worked for Wright Medical Technology, designing, manufacturing, and distributing orthopedic implant devices for reconstruction and fixation, including biologics that contain both human and animal tissue. Paul moved into advanced wound therapy products with Kinetic Concepts Acelity, leading the company's global quality and regulatory organization and helping in strategic acquisitions of both intellectual property and companies to expand the business portfolio. He then served on the leadership team for Becton Dickinson's Biosciences division, driving breakthrough discoveries in immuno-oncology and developing new frontiers in single-cell multi-omics research. So welcome, Paul. Phil Brown is actually joining us today from England. Phil Brown started his career at Smith & Nephew, qualifying as a graduate of the Royal Society of Chemistry in 1984, before joining the company's wound care division regulatory affairs team. He has worked for Genzyme Biosurgery, Quintiles, Wright Medical Technology, and most recently, Kinetic Concepts Acelity, including work with novel technologies, liaising with national authorities, the European Commission, trade associations, and standards bodies on issues related to regulation and ethics. Phil extended his trade association work by joining ABHI, the Association of British Health Tech Industries, in June 2016 as the director responsible for regulatory and compliance matters. Phil is a fellow of TOPRA and lectures at the Sheffield Hallam University on medical device regulatory frameworks. He also chairs the UK BSI's CH210 working group, which has a mirror relationship to the ISO committee responsible for quality and risk standards. So Paul and Phil, welcome. We look forward to your talk, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeremy. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining Phil and me today. We've known each other for 15 years, as you can hear some of the similar companies that we've been a part of. And one thing that we definitely know is that there's always something we can depend upon, and that's change. And the pace of evolution means that we're constantly charting trends, trying to stay in front of the waves of what's happening in the marketplace. And especially from a medical technology perspective, it certainly doesn't disappoint with regard to innovation. Plenty of industry altering forces from which to choose: the expanding role of additive manufacturing. FDA recently published a first of its kind guidance document on 3D printing technology with regard to med devices. And then of course, cloud computing and increased supply chain efficiencies. I mean, it just continues to go on and on. So today we'll briefly talk about our organizations, just to give you some context about where we're spending our time. And then we'll cover a little bit about medical device innovations over the years, and then talk about globalization and the impact of governments, policies, and innovative technologies. And that'll lead us into how med technology companies are following the footsteps of other industry sectors when it comes to growth and expansion. And then we'll talk about macro trends from healthcare technology users and innovators, and how micro trends have spun off from these. And then lastly, we'll cover some of the solutions that manufacturers have participated in with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. So from Jabil's perspective, just to give you an idea about the company, we were founded in 1966, and they actually was similar to the whole Steve Jobs started in a garage, and it was a couple of guys named James and Bill. That's how we got our name, Jabil. And they repaired boards, PC boards for the automotive industry. So they were based out of Auburn Hills, Michigan. And then it just took off from there. And so today we've got almost 54 million square feet of manufacturing space. We're in more than 100 countries around the world, 240,000 employees. And then we've got revenues just this past year that just exceeded 27 billion. And just to give you an idea of some of the places where we're located. So you see some of the areas in Asia, Europe, Middle East, Latin America, and then of course North America. And we're headquartered out of St. Petersburg, Florida. And then the different sectors that we're a part of, cloud-based solutions is something pretty new with regard to what Jabil is into today. But all these other areas that you see, more than likely you've either got something in your car or in your house, maybe at work, that's got either a component or it's been manufactured by Jabil. Jabil is a contract manufacturer, so we don't put our name or brand on anything today. We service a lot of different companies, and you can see where these touch the different sectors. And then specifically in my area in healthcare, within the Jabil regulated industry sector, you see we've got wearables that we manufacture, diagnostics, different devices, and we'll talk a little bit more about those, and then also pharmaceutical delivery systems. So we're involved with what's going on now with the pandemic, and some of the syringes and drug delivery systems that we manufacture will be used as part of the COVID-19 solution.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. And hopefully you can hear me. Thank you for the invitation to present to you today. It's a real honor to be with you in Texas, albeit virtually. So let's talk about ABHI briefly. ABHI is an industry association covering health technologies in the UK. Everything from diagnostics through to medical technologies, which include low risk sticking plasters right the way through to high risk implants and electrical equipment, as well as now increasingly more digital programs. And of course, the regulatory processes are very different throughout, and we might sort of touch on some of those. But just so that to give you again some context, we have around 300 members, 310 members within ABHI, which doesn't really sound that very much when you consider that there are nearly 3,000 medical technology industries in the UK itself. So we represent probably around 12 to 14% of all the med tech companies in the UK, but those 310 companies represent probably around 80% of sales into the National Health Service. So we're probably the biggest of the industry associations in this area. And as such, as a sort of an association, we provide that peer-to-peer networking. We allow for work with our government agencies and so on. it was a wise man who said to me once, when I asked what the role of a trade association was, or an industry association was, and he said, well, we try to do the things which companies find difficult to do. So actually that integration and working with governments, all of the different departments within governments, to both anticipate and influence what's actually required for medical technology companies, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from a procurement perspective. And then more interestingly, I guess for you guys as well, one of the things that we're doing, and it's not necessarily Brexit related because we were doing international work before Brexit, it's just that it maybe have accelerated some of our programs. We do have a number of SMEs that we work with, obviously in the UK, and we run a US accelerator program out of Austin. So that's a really, really useful program for us, where we can take UK SMEs across to Texas to understand what the environment is for healthcare in the US, as well as to help them understand what the regulatory processes are to enable them to impact and start to sell and market and innovate products in the US. And we do that vice versa. So very strong US links. Next slide, please, Paul. And then just to give you a few ideas of the things that we do. So not only regulation, but we also work on policy, working with the, as I say, with the different government agencies. We've been doing a lot of work on Brexit, as you can imagine, trying to figure out where the UK is going to sit and how far we're going to drift into the mid-Atlantic. We also sort of work with a number of clinical groups on research, and you can imagine as well on some of that clinical work, we've been heavily involved also in some of the pandemic work with COVID-19. And then, of course, we have the intelligence and events sections. It's always a strange thing for me to talk about regulatory intelligence. It's one of those oxymorons, I think. But anyway, we sort of try to provide and anticipate for companies changes in regulations and market forces, so that they can better understand and market their products. So I think that's a little bit of context for ABHI, Paul. So you can move on to your next slide, I think.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Phil. So just want to give you a couple slides on a bit of a history lesson here. So, you know, the first industrial revolution began in 1760, and thanks to Phil and his ancestors, they helped start that for the world. And during the start of the second industrial revolution, which was around the turn of the century, the U.S. began to transition from a largely agrarian society into an increasingly urbanized one. And so with going into the cities, there needed to be solutions. So a lot of mechanization occurred, and by the mid-19th century, industrialization was well established, not only in the US, but also throughout Western Europe. And then, so invention and innovation were in full stride. And you can see here at the beginning of the timeline, not so much happening, right? I mean, you see some things in stethoscopes, and, you know, even a tongue depressor is a Class 1 device, and it's regulated by the FDA. But so some pretty simple kinds of activities. But then as the Industrial Revolution really came into being, you saw a big uptick of solutions, of inventors and innovations that needed to solve problems. What's interesting about this slide, and you'll see the hand on the bottom. So that was the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen that discovered and came up with that discovered X-rays, and that's just the hand of his wife. So she was subject to one of the first X-rays ever. And then you see the one just to the right of it, the first cardiac catheterization by Werner Forssmann, and he did that to himself. So you had a lot of these innovators that were so passionate about what they discovered and what could be possible that they weren't afraid to do some of these things on themselves just to prove a point. And then, of course, with World War II and things sort of slowed some, but there still needed to be solutions for wounded soldiers and so forth. So then you see where the first kidney dialysis machine was invented by Wilhelm Kolff, and then of course one of the first hip replacement surgeries that occurred in the U.S. by Dr. Austin Moore. So as you move into the mid 90s now, 1900s, now it begins to really get compact. You see on the far left an electrical engineer that invented the first commercially available artificial heart valve. So, and then as you keep going to the right, you've got an external cardiac pacemaker and then an internal cardiac pacemaker. I mean, the innovation just kept going and going and going. And, certainly it didn't just take engineers. It took engineers, biologists, chemists, physicists. It took all kinds of scientists to bring what could be possible, right? I mean, it's how do we make and solve solutions for, in this particular space, healthcare, that can help save people's lives, that can help prolong life, that kind of thing, and make it better. Now, not until the early 1900s, FDA came into being. It's one of the oldest comprehensive consumer protection agencies in the federal government, and it's actually been in existence. It wasn't called the U.S. Food and Drug Administration at the time, but it was in existence since 1848, and it was to monitor the safety of agricultural products, right? So in our agrarian society, we had a lot of agriculture going on and a lot of food being delivered. And then, was it spoiled? How was it cared for? Things like that. And so the government got involved, obviously, because that was providing the food source to the country. And then, although it's not, in 1930, FDA came into being. The name FDA came into being, and then they came up with, in 1906, prior to that, the Pure Food and Drugs Act. So there needed to be something to regulate these new innovations, to regulate drugs and that type of thing. But not until 1976 did the government have something that was specifically for medical devices. So very interesting. I mean, within our recent history here, this regulation that came into being with regard to the U.S. Was really important, because these, again, innovations were happening. How were they being placed onto the market? How were companies controlling it? What were the clinical studies like, if any, that kind of thing? And so, you remember, many of you remember back in the early 80s, you had the first artificial heart. And then it just snowballed from there. And then, so regulation was really important. Phil, want to talk about the European piece?
Yeah, sure. In many ways, it sort of mirrors what you've got on there. And I think all I would add to your slide here, Paul, is that you go as far as 2000 on the right-hand side, but even between 2000 and 2020, we're looking very much more, and we'll talk in later slides, about how technologies are beginning to converge. So you don't only just have artificial hearts now, but you have artificial hearts where you are using engineering and tissue engineering to actually introduce live cells into these sorts of processes. So where biology is meeting up with physics and chemistry and everything, and it's just an incredibly dynamic space, and that's what makes working in medical technology so much fun.
So you can see that through what's the challenge of medical device manufacturers today? Well, it continues to get more and more complex, and the solutions begin to get smaller, right? The miniaturization occurs, and what we talk about is what's transformational. How do we take some of these different technologies and these different sciences and combine them and go solve some problems? And then, of course, once you do that, how quickly can you get it to market? And again, that's part of the control from a regulatory perspective that's really very important.
And then I think just to follow on from that, this the next slide here really shows how from those early days back in the 1970s, where regulation was really quite nationally based. If I remember back to the times before the Medical Devices Directive here in Europe, and I guess the same in the US with the FDA's control in 1976, you ended up having to do loads and loads of different regulatory processes in order to actually market your product, because there are lots of different regulations around. Spain had different regulations to Italy, to Sweden, to Norway. And what we've seen since then is a drive towards globalization. There's lots of spinning plates on this particular slide, and there are lots of things which need to actually all be integrated into the process. So we have global initiatives already in place. So, for example, this one on the bottom left hand side, MDSAP, is the Medical Device Single Audit Program, and is something which all of those countries in that slide buy into, so that if you're doing quality auditing in one country, it will be recognized in another, because we'll all be doing the same sorts of processes. And then interestingly, I think as you go around this slide, the national competent authorities are beginning to think in the same ways as we start looking at what we call IMDRF, or International Medical Device Regulator Forum guidelines. All of those are all based on very similar processes, trying to globalize how we do things. What we then have are things like conformity assessment bodies, who are the bodies who do a lot of the technical requirements and do a lot of the technical auditing of companies. So here again we have big companies like BSI and MDC and DECRA, all working along the same processes. And I think we'll talk a little bit more in some of the later slides on some of those sort of quality system standards, which then is on the right hand side. And mentioned right at the beginning that for my sins, I work on some of those ISO committees, sort of working through international standards to make sure that everybody is working to the same process. And then regulation, interestingly, when we're talking in the UK, particularly with a Brexit hat on, is looking at how regulation butts up against trade. Quite often regulation facilitates trade, and you have mutual recognition agreements between companies who between countries who recognize each other's regulatory processes, which enable trade to happen. So regulation is becoming increasingly more important to enable this globalization, and of course that's increasingly more important with some of the new technologies that are going on, particularly things like digital processes, where in Europe maybe some of those digital regulations are not as quickly evolving as they are here over in Norway, over in the US. I was thinking I was already in the US then, but sort of seeing how those sorts of then work, and how we can perhaps in the UK integrate into some of those sorts of things. So real globalization, and that's one of the joys of my past career, having worked with Paul, you know, is that we truly sort of worked in that global way, trying to understand how we could manage our products onto a market, not just US and UK, but all around the place. Fascinating sort of area to sort of try and get to grips with.
So just want to talk some about what the manufacturer movement has meant. You know, in the early 90s, you had a lot of consolidation when it comes to computers, right? So Dell had opened up a facility in Malaysia. You've got HP who also targeted some of the Asia countries as well. Intel offshored a lot of their semiconductor manufacturing and so forth. But then with the advent of contract manufacturers, so they began to take on some of that workload. And why is that? Well, because contract manufacturers were in some of these regions already. So as companies came into being, and they didn't have the capital to go and make investments when it comes to the equipment and things like that, and also establish some of the relationships with suppliers in regions, so you had a good speed to market after you create or manufacture a product. Contract manufacturers were where a lot of startups went, and that's still the same today. Even sort of startups for med device, so new technology, new innovations, they don't have the investment yet to go and build it themselves, and so they look to contract manufacturers. And so you see some of the big ones, Celestica, Flex, and Jabil, were some of the big contract manufacturers at the time, especially in the early 90s. And then look, it took about 20 years, honestly, to get to where contract manufacturers, the big ones, began to look and said, the life of a electronic component, the life of a mobile phone, the life of a computer, it's short. And so they were looking around to say, how do we have something that lasts longer? So coming from an orthopedics company, what I can tell you is docs love their instruments and they love the devices that they use. So they don't like to change. We talk about innovation and so forth, but they like how they do an approach, let's say, with regard to a hip replacement. There's been a lot of innovations around knee replacements. The incisions used to be 10 inches long. Now you're doing something that's a lot less, because you can do things inside the body as opposed to having to open it up all the way. And again, we were looking to legal manufacturers or OEMs. We're looking to how do we continue to grow. And so when we reached into other parts of the globe where we could do that, again, it was, well, we didn't have the infrastructure at the time. So who did we go to? It was these contract manufacturers. So then you began to see a lot of consolidation. So Jabil, my company, purchased Nipro Healthcare. Nipro Healthcare is very, very good, had a great assembly product, but then also a lot of people for molding. And so they have a lot of different products that they mold, silicone, over molding, things like that. And so again, that was how do we make products cheaper, better, quicker? We went into molding for some of that activity as opposed to just machining, pure machining. So you see some of those companies listed there. And then, and again, I'll just talk a little bit about one of the first things that Johnson & Johnson did is they looked at internally and they said, what do we want to be good at? And they said, well, we're good at designing and innovating. We're good at sales and marketing. And they didn't invest a lot into their operational space with regard to the manufacturing sites. So they were looking to say, hey, how do we make that better? Came to Jabil, and they said we worked with them and struck up a deal, and we said, okay, so we'll take over some of your manufacturing locations, which is exactly what happened in the early 90s and in the 2010s. Some of these manufacturing locations by some of these companies were taken over, let's say, or handed over to these contract manufacturers. So what are the advantages of that? Well, from an OEM perspective, it reduces their capital, their investment in manufacturing facilities. It reduces the cost to keep pace with reimbursement. There's a lot of, on the healthcare side, there's a lot of pressure to reduce how much governments are reimbursing for surgeries and the like. And then also concentrate on their strengths, right? And I mentioned that, design, marketing, sales, and distribution. For a contract manufacturer, then profit margins, right? But the investments have already been made in more efficient processes, in automating a lot of the assembly processes, as well as the manufacturing and machining processes. And then the relationships with suppliers, with the supply chain, was also quite important.
So I guess though, Paul, you'll probably agree that sometimes though the life of the contract manufacturer is a bit of a lonely one. And, at the end of the day, it's the legal manufacturer's name that gets known. It's like it's the comparison of the quarterback being the legal manufacturer. Everybody knows who the quarterbacks are, and they're the ones whose name's on the label. It's the legal manufacturer who has all of those sorts of responsibilities that are on the left-hand side of that space. They have responsibilities for vigilance, for ensuring that their suppliers are all there in place. It's they're available. They're responsible for the data and the labeling. So they're the sort of the glamour side of the product that's being placed on the market. Whereas the contract manufacturer is almost the linebacker in a way. If it wasn't for the contract manufacturer, the quarterback wouldn't be able to do his job, right? But the contract manufacturer is dealing with all of those things like the quality management systems, the document control, the change controls, the complaints perhaps that are coming in. And so that link between the contract manufacturer and the legal manufacturer is incredibly strong. And we talk about the quality management systems aligning and all of that sort of stuff. But it's one of those really strange things that Jabil is $27 billion. Yet it's not as well known as some of the smaller medical device manufacturers because they're the glamour boys, right? And then sort of on the right hand side, where we've got the little Brexit thing there, I just put that one in there when we were sort of developing these slides to just show you some of the things that we're trying to discuss as the UK, as we become more and more independent through Brexit, thinking about how that document flow, how that component flow, how the product flow is between that relationship between legal manufacturer and the contract manufacturer. How are we going to deal ultimately with things like customs moving products and components between France and the UK, how we ensure that we have people moving across to do research and those sorts of things, and how that affects that relationship between the contract manufacturer. And of course, then you have the regulatory processes in between those two countries, how you have conformity assessment bodies working across borders and things like that. So the Brexit has just made things even more complicated than those first two boxes.
So some of the areas, think about product categories across the medical device spectrum, and includes in vitro diagnostics too, right? So important right today with regard to diagnosing the pandemic and diagnosing what's happening with COVID-19. So, but you see a lot of different areas where, again, the gamut of science and technology is needing all the different disciplines to be a part of it. Blood management, cell counting. Cell counting helps us manage disease and drugs that are used to manage disease. You see the wearables, that's new. And then in particular, diabetes care. I mean, I think everybody understands that today you've got more and more people who are developing diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and things like that. So it's a place where now it's very consumerized, right? You can go into the clinic, you can go into your corner and get something that does your blood glucose monitoring and so forth. Back to minimally invasive devices. I mean, so critical. Why is that? Because you can recover from surgery a lot faster, right? You don't have to cut into muscle. You don't have to cut into tissue. You can actually reach things a lot easier with this minimally invasive devices. Next generation sequencing, so genomics, again, very critical. So can you anticipate if somebody who's going to be subject to some sort of cancer or whatever in the future, or is susceptible, has a certain gene, and so then you begin to monitor that person or that patient to say, okay, can we get early detection? So it's so critical with regard to diseases. Point of care testing. Many of you may have gone to yourself and you've done the drive-through COVID test, right? So that kind of point of care testing is really important. Surgical robotics is now, I guess it's the latest with regard to a lot of the surgeries, and companies are coming out of the woodworks on this. So you've got to have instruments, you've got to have software, you've got to have trainers, right, to train people to be able to use these devices as well. And then of course, women's health. Phil will comment about that one.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, when Paul showed me these slides, I said, oh, it'd be really good to highlight this this square which has women's health on, and I think that I asked him to do that because we must never forget, or we never forget in our industry and in our companies, that in fact at the end of all of these processes there is a patient, and you know, companies and manufacturers are developing diabetes care, minimally invasive care, robotics, and now women's health type products to help people and to actually sort of help the patient at the end of the day. And here in the UK, we've had a very recent case where we've had a review of the safety of medicines and medical devices, a review which was carried out independently by Baroness Cumberledge, who sort of looked into the safety of products, particularly in our devices area, into things like surgical meshes and how surgical mesh was used as part of a women's health program. And that's prompting real change and real thought as to how we can not only innovate products, but to innovate the regulatory processes which are there to control those products. So how we introduce things like the patient voice into the development of products, how we introduce more post-market surveillance work into these programs, so that we're constantly looking as to how these products are working once we've actually marketed them and are actually out on the marketplace there. So lots and lots of different forces, if you like, within society, which is shaping not only what products we have, but also how the products are controlled and regulated. And as regulatory professionals and quality professionals such as Paul and I, it's important to understand that whole holistic approach so that you can successfully market and use your products.
So I've got the spinning wheel. Hold on just a second.
The donut of death, we call it.
I know it. At least it's not the blue screen. So again, I just wanted to, let's go back here. Let's go back one. Just wanted to give you a sense of where some of these companies, and you've probably seen a lot of them in the news, just even on pictures through hospitals and things like that during this crisis. So minimally invasive devices, you see CR Bard that was purchased by BD not too long ago. Just more than a year and a half ago now. The robotics and surgical devices piece, so you see Intuitive Surgical, they were the first company that came out with this thing called the Da Vinci robot, and it was the first surgical robot that was used. But then you see all these other companies like J&J, Medtronic, Smith & Nephew, and then they go across the spectrum, right, of these categories. So you see the orthopedics, and of course diabetes, and the point of care testing, and then the genomics piece. Phil, do you want to comment about the?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that I've played around with one of those Da Vinci robots, and they are incredible. They really are amazing to see and to work, especially when you have the virtual reality headsets on, and you realize that you're actually working surgical instruments which are actually situated about 30 feet away from you with such precision and accuracy. And of course, all of those innovations are there really to sort of cut down on the potentials for surgical infections, as well as improving the accuracy of the surgery itself. But it's quite interesting to point out on this slide, if you look under that box there, you have the surgical devices and robotics and the orthopedics. You have a similar bunch of companies at the bottom there: Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, Smith & Nephew, Stryker, and Zimmer. And one of the beauties or challenges within the regulations and the way that we do work globally, not just in the UK and in Europe, is that each one of those companies will have their own way of doing business and their own way of structuring their companies. So when we sort of start thinking about quality management systems and how we control manufacturing through quality management systems, Johnson & Johnson might have a perfectly good quality management system for their robotic devices, but it will be completely different from the quality management system that Medtronic uses. That's not wrong. Both companies are exactly right. They're still in compliance with the requirements and the regulations. It's just that they tailor and work with those requirements depending on the way that the company works and the way that the company is organized. And I have to say that that's one of the really exciting things of working in this medical devices field. You don't get that in pharmaceutical products, but which is very prescriptive in the way that it deals with regulation. But in medical devices, it's much better for that, for the regulatory person with the agile mind to sort of think, well, I can satisfy this requirement by doing this, but it's going to be different from somebody else the way that you do it. And it's just a terrific sort of excitement in sort of even designing those things like quality management systems. And then I think, Paul, we just wanted on this slide to sort of give a flavour of where some of those macro and micro trends seem to be going. And sort of as you go from left to right here on this this slide, you can see that there is, and think back to that slide where we had all of the different technologies on that timeline. Everything's getting really, really quick now, and we're beginning to sort of start thinking of really highly innovative sort of processes and programs, particularly in things like personalized medicine, digital therapeutics, companion diagnostics and combination products, combining both biology with engineering or pharmaceuticals with engineering, that sort of stuff. And then even sort of looking at the 3D printing sort of slide there, how you sort of use 3D printing to actually do to make your medical devices. If I sort of think of the UK requirements here, just very briefly, the medical devices directive and regulations actually suggest that custom made products, which is in effect what 3D printing products are, have to be regulated individually as medical devices. Now, if you're making a million and a half dental implants every year by 3D printing, how on earth are you going to regulate all of those as individual products? So the regulations are changing and adapting to actually look at things like 3D printing as processes, so regulating processes rather than regulating the devices themselves. So that innovation is, as I said before, it's not just necessarily with the products, it's also with the actual processes that you use to regulate them. And then, of course, you have all of these micro trends around them. So even on the top there, sort of thinking about how you work and how devices are interoperably. So if you're working in a intensive care unit, making sure that your devices aren't interfering with other products that you're using, or making sure that you can plug in certain products into others to ensure that you have a continuum of patient care and the like. And then even on things like wellnesses, I mean, if we were to ask how many people in the audience have smartwatches or Apple Watches on at the moment, it's sitting there collecting all of that heart data, and it's probably transmitting it over to your GP, your general practitioner, at this very moment in time, and saying, Phil, blimey, you're on this presentation and your heart rate's up like phenomenal amounts. And so that interaction, not only with the devices, but the way that it sort of works with the healthcare system is changing. And so that slide, if you remember back to the timescales, it was sort of slow as we were sort of moving through the 20th century, and it's getting faster and faster and faster, and it just needs all of this sort of stuff to be the fascination is globalizing it and making sure that all of these really critical technologies are made available to patients at the end of the day, and that's what we're sort of trying to develop these products for.
So what's happening from a growth perspective with regard to devices? Well, regionalization, we talk about that, and how have companies got into other markets, and a lot of it is because some of these established companies with regard to even the electronics piece are there already. What's the long-term impact on COVID-19? Who would have ever even thought about that 5-letter word? In March to say, okay, we've got this issue now, especially coming out of China, but so much increased awareness. And what's interesting is I did get a chance to travel on an airplane about a month ago, and you sit there and you're sitting face forward, you've got your mask on, you don't cough, you don't sneeze, you don't look around, you don't talk, kind of thing. I mean, the world has completely changed. And so it's not just about a vaccine, but it's about these ancillary things. Masks are now fashionable, right? And you want to have the right kind of mask that fits properly and so forth. And that leads into the diagnostics piece. And then delivery models have changed quite a bit. I mean, you can go get devices that you couldn't even 20 years ago, and at your local pharmacy. So, blood pressure monitors, things like that. The delivery of healthcare has got to change with the times, and it has to be more available to the patients. How do you do that? Well, they can't keep going to the hospital all the time. So you begin to you make portable devices that people can take back into their homes. Used to, you'd stay in the hospital until you're done with that therapy, right? But now people take those into their own homes, and then you have healthcare providers that go and attend to you, maybe do a wound change with regard to bandages and so forth. And then, of course, the demand for consumers and miniaturization, making things smaller, faster, better, and responding to the needs of patients. We're in such an information age now, that people can go do their own research before you go and talk to a doctor about maybe your knee or hip or what have you. You actually can go and people can do reviews and say, I'd like to have this sort of product as opposed to that one. So very, very interesting how these trends have changed.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, actually, just sort of to finish off on that slide, I think that when you think it's not just the products which are innovating in there, it's actually the healthcare systems which are learning from things like COVID-19. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned on number 4 there, there's sort of the move towards things like telemedicine. I was speaking with a hospital in Birmingham only the other week that was talking about how they're doing things like physiotherapy via Zoom and stuff like this. And it's prompted sort of discussions within the healthcare system here as to whether or not we should have these massive outpatient clinics, whether we should be inviting patients in for their routine checkups once they've had surgeries or whatever. And lots of drives within the healthcare systems themselves when it comes to this sort of learning. And that translates also to the regulatory authority. The regulators are also thinking about how they can learn from those experiences, how they can ensure that these new technologies, if we think about COVID and ventilators, for example, we're in desperate need for ventilators back in March. Actually sort of streamlining and ensuring that we have those huge volumes of technologies in our hospitals using expedited review processes. Those are the sorts of things the regulators are thinking about, but in a holistic way and involving the patient, the surgeons, the notified bodies, the regulators, industry, everybody within that whole process of making sure that we get safe and effective product to the patient. So not just medical devices are growing, it's actually the process and the systems which are growing alongside it, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, good point. So from design to the users, you think about this convergence of technology, and what does that mean? So for a med device manufacturer, it's very labor intensive. Lots of different disciplines need to contribute to that. Lots of infrastructure, and sometimes these regulatory approvals a lot of times take time, right? But on the healthcare provider side, what's that mean? That if you have these technology convergence, there's more clinical sharing of clinical information. You've got some reduced errors because now you've got this data entry from an electronic perspective, and enhanced efficiency by clinicians on the use of the technologies, because we're smarter. I mean, we use handheld devices all the time, and they're able to use that in their settings. And then this piece about delivery of care. So we've turned devices into portable devices now, and so they have to be very rugged to withstand a home environment, as opposed to a hospital setting where you kind of treat it right very carefully, and that there's a biomedical group that takes care of these devices and does a lot of maintenance. From a healthcare provider perspective, it's a benefit to the patients so they can get home quicker. You reduce hospitalization infections as well, and so that's something that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have put onto hospitals, that they have to reduce the number of infections that they cause. And then lastly, on the computer-aided surgery and robotics, on the med device, you know, one of the things that the companies need to be sure of is that there's use, that they train the healthcare providers very well, so that there's not use errors. So that can sometimes occur. And then like Phil said, there's a lot more accuracy with regard to some of these surgical procedures when you can deal with robots and have that. And then you can always, in the healthcare setting, you can always check back and see how's the robot moving. Is it going to where it needs to, and monitor that electronically. So just a couple more slides here. So I just wanted to share with you a bit about what manufacturers are doing with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you see some pictures of some of the factories that we have within the Jabil network. And we're now making N95 masks, like a lot of companies are, face shields. This splitter in the upper right-hand corner was a design by a hospital group in North Carolina that we've actually 3D printed. And then, of course, analyzers are being ramped up, because you got to get this the diagnostics piece complete with regard to COVID-19, and of course reagent filling. So that's a lot of we got to get vaccines out there and get test kits ready to go as well. And this is just that example I was sharing with you. So we partnered with J&J. The government came to Johnson & Johnson because they wanted, this was free. The Prisma Health said, here's a design for a splitter, because we didn't have a whole lot of ventilators at the time. And the government came to J&J and said, we'd rather have a medical device company who understands labeling and how to get products to the market and so forth, be the ones who help make that happen. So they came to my company and said, you've got a lot of additive manufacturing, a lot of 3D printers. And so we went from concept to design and launched product within 10 days. And what did that mean? That meant that it didn't have to be used as much, but they were making decisions in hospitals about which patient would get a ventilator and who wouldn't. And so it was free. The J&J developed it. We partnered with them, and then we provided these splitters for free. So it's fast. And you know what, the regulators, especially FDA, but they went into solving the regulatory hurdles. We went to emergent use authorization that got these out to market very quickly. So last slide here. So what do medical device manufacturers need to be doing in the future? Well, having same processes, having an ecosystem that they can manufacture within, that also communicates with the OEMs and what they're doing from a design perspective, is quite important. And so we talk a lot about factory of the future. And what does that mean? Well, it means you've got a lot of digital solutions within the factory itself that can provide you data and feedback as quickly as it's happening, so that you can go make the right decision with regard to the product. You've got smart factory floor automation, so you have a lot of heads-up displays. You see how the equipment is operating. Is there a potential where equipment is about to go down? That kind of thing. And then we have to be smarter with regard to the regulatory piece, but then also how do we support the OEMs with regard to the supplier network, because we need the reliability of the supply is just so important. So not a whole lot of time left there, Jeremy, but we got through everything.
Sure. It's been very interesting. I appreciate it. We do have a couple questions that have come in. The first one is there a standard amount of time for a testing stage for medical devices before actually getting to the experimental stage for humans, or does the time depend on what type of device they're working on?
Yeah, very much. Very much. It depends on the products. If you look at the whole spectrum of medical devices, going from, as Paul said, a tongue depressor through to a CAT scanner and every product in between, most, if not all, of the regulatory processes in the world divide that hundreds of thousands of devices into risk classifications. So depending on what the risk is, depends on the degree of safety which you do in order to demonstrate safety before going into the clinic. And then, of course, that then also, if you then sort of think about a short-term use, high-risk product, I'm trying to think of something like an absorbable dressing or a medicated dressing or something which may be in contact with the patient for 3 or 4 days, and trying to juxtapose that against a hip implant which could be in the patient for 10 years. So again, you've got not only that sort of differentiation in the preclinic stage, but then once you've marketed the product and you've got your clinical data, that degree of post-market surveillance that you have to do in order to ensure that your product is still safe whilst it's being used, again, depends on the risk and the way that the product is used.
Great, thank you. This will be our last question because we're starting to run out of time, but has the increased speed of innovation affected the regulatory process and how companies operate within those regulations? Because you showed at the beginning the slides with, things sort of happen slowly and then all of a sudden it's just like one thing after another. So how does that affect how companies react to regulations or how regulations are created?
So I'll start there. The kinds of industry help that we have are really kind of like Phil's organization, as well as in the US. We have one called AdvaMed, and they help manufacturers talk to regulators so that we can work together to be sure that it's not so onerous. What I'll say is that there's a patient at the end of everything we do, and so it's got to be safe, but it also needs to be very effective, right? So you want to be able to solve for a solution. So FDA is really helped quite a bit recently, especially through this COVID pandemic, and they've changed on ways of working as well. Phil, you want to?
Yeah, very much. And just as a sort of an illustration, if you think of a pharmaceutical product, you may be looking between 8 and 12 years before you get the product on the market. With a device, you might be looking at 1 to 2 years. And with a digital product, you may be looking at 3 to 6 months. So in fact, when you look at the products themselves, quite often we find, and Paul and I, we were sort of working on some of those human tissue engineering type products and use of human materials. Sometimes the speed of innovation outstrips the ability of the regulator to actually come up with effective regulation. And in those instances, as Paul says, there is a great deal of collaboration and understanding that goes on between the industry and the regulator in order to ensure that you do have those safe products actually getting to patients. At the end of the day, we're here to innovate and to deliver to patients safe and effective product. No company exists to produce product which is unsafe, which is one of those sort of weird things that sometimes people throw at you. But in order to do that, particularly in these very fast-moving areas, you need that collaboration with the regulator in order to ensure that happens.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Phil. We really appreciate you taking your time to speak to us today. It's been great. For the people that are in the audience, if you want to look at this again, view the recording, the URL is in the question and answer line. Thanks very much again, and we will see you next week at the next virtual brown bag.
Thank you.
Thank you.